Okay, so you've got this stack of legal documents about probate, right? And you need to get up to speed quick. But like, where do you even start?
It can be a bit overwhelming, I know.
Yeah, it's like you suddenly landed in a new city, you've got the map, but no idea where to go first.
Exactly.
So we're talking special proceedings in the Philippine legal system here, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's like specialized courts, you know? They handle specific tasks, like when someone passes away and you have to figure out who gets what.
So it's not just any old courtroom where any legal issue could be dealt with?
No, not at all. And here's the thing. The list of what counts as a special proceeding isn't set in stone, you know?
Oh, interesting.
The rules of court give some examples, like if a company wants to dissolve itself voluntarily. But you also have things like annulments or protection orders, and those fall under this umbrella too.
So it's more about the type of legal question, not some strict checklist.
Exactly. Like if it's about proving a specific legal right or a fact, it's probably a special proceeding.
Okay, that makes sense. So back to probate. Someone passes away, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where does all this legal stuff actually happen?
Right, that's where venue comes in. The court that handles this, it's the regional trial court in the city or province where the person last lived.
So you'd file it where they lived, not where they, passed away.
Exactly. It's kind of like taxes, you know. You usually file them based on where you live.
That's a good way to remember it. Okay, so you mentioned that settling an estate, it can sometimes be done with a summary settlement, which sounds way less intimidating than a full court case. What's that exactly?
Summary settlement is like the express lane. You go to the court, all the documents are there, everything's in order, and boom, you're done.
Wow, that sounds super efficient. What do you need to qualify for that express lane, so to speak?
Two main things. First, the estate's total value can't be more than 5 million pesos.
Okay, so smaller estate.
Yeah. And second, all the heirs have to be adults, legally speaking. That's 18 or older here.
Got it. So everyone involved can make their own decisions. So it's about simplifying things when there's not as much at stake.
Exactly. It saves everyone time, money, and stress, especially during a tough time, you know?
For sure. But are there ever times when, even if an estate qualifies, some heirs might want a more in-depth process?
Oh, absolutely. You know how families are, right? Even when they're close, disagreements can happen. Maybe there's questions about the value of something, or some heirs think the will isn't right. In those cases, summary settlement might not be the best fit.
So even though it's meant to be simple, there's still room for things to get complicated.
Exactly. And that leads us to the next topic, allowance and disallowance of wills.
Okay, let's get into that. If someone has a will, isn't that document automatically followed?
Not necessarily. A will has to go through probate. That's where the court checks if it's legit, you know?
So there's more to it than just reading the will and doing what it says.
Oh yeah, way more. The court needs to be absolutely sure the will is real, no tampering, no funny business, and that it really reflects what the person wanted. They also check for fraud. Like, did someone pressure the person into writing it a certain way?
It's like those movie scenes where someone's like, this will is a fake.
Haha, exactly. It's all about making sure the deceased person's wishes are truly carried out fairly.
Wow, there's so much that goes into this. So what about these letters testamentary and letters of administration? They sound pretty intense.
They do sound formal, don't they? But basically, they give someone the authority to manage the estate legally.
So it's like getting the keys to the castle. But how do they decide who gets these keys?
Well, if there's a valid will, the court issues letters testamentary to whoever is named the executor in the will. They're the one in charge, basically.
Okay, makes sense.
But if there's no will, or the named executor can't do it, then the court appoints someone and they get letters of administration instead.
So it's all about who's in charge and making sure things are done right, whether there's a will or not.
Exactly. Understanding who has these letters is super important, especially if you're involved in settling the estate. They're the ones making the decisions. Gathering assets, paying debts, distributing what's left to the heirs.
Big responsibility.
Oh, for sure. They don't have free rein, though. They have to answer to the court and act in the best interest of the estate and the beneficiaries.
So it's not just like they can do whatever they want.
Nope. It has to be by the book. And the court is there to make sure of that.
Okay, that's good to know. So it's about giving them the power to manage things, but also making sure they're accountable.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it gets even trickier if the estate doesn't have enough to cover all its debts.
That makes sense. So what happens then?
Well, that's something we can explore in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
Perfect, because I'm definitely curious to hear more about that. But for now, I think this is a good place to take a break. Join us for part 2, where we'll continue unraveling the mysteries of probate proceedings in the Philippines. All right, we're back and ready to dive back into probate. It's crazy how much there is to consider, even with something like settling debts, as we talked about before.
Yeah, for sure. It's not just about adding up the numbers and paying everyone off. Each case is different, you know? And sometimes the assets just aren't enough to cover everything.
So what happens then? When the estate's in debt and the assets come up short, how does the court decide who gets paid and how much?
Well, like we touched on earlier, there's a specific order for settling debts laid out in Philippine law. Think of it like a line. Certain creditors get priority, depending on what kind of claim they have.
So it's not just a mad rush. There's a system in place to keep things fair.
Right. It's about bringing some order to what can be a pretty messy situation. Like you said before, things like funeral costs and taxes, those usually come first. You gotta lay the deceased to rest and take care of those obligations before anything else.
Makes sense. Got to prioritize those essential expenses. It's like closing those final chapters before moving on to the rest of the estate's financial stuff.
I like that. A good analogy. It's about respecting those final needs and fulfilling legal duties before you can even think about giving any remaining assets to the heirs.
So, okay, let's say those are taken care of. Funeral costs, taxes. What's next in this line of creditors?
Next up are usually the secured creditors. These are the folks who have a claim on a specific asset of the estate. Think like a mortgage on a house or a car loan. The lender, they have a right to that specific property if the loan isn't paid back.
So even in death, those debts stick with the property.
Yeah, that's right. They have a legal claim to those assets, so their claims need to be settled before anything else can happen with those properties.
It's like the debt follows the asset, even as it becomes part of the estate. Makes sense. What about unsecured creditors then? Where do they fall in all this?
Unsecured creditors, like those who gave personal loans or credit card companies, they're further down the line. Their claims aren't tied to a specific thing, so they're a little more vulnerable.
So if there's not much left after paying off secured creditors and essential expenses, they might not get everything they're owed.
It's a possibility, yeah, unfortunately. And sometimes they might not get anything at all if the estate's completely tapped out.
That's rough. It's a reminder that even though we're talking about legal processes, there are real people affected by this.
Absolutely. It's a complex situation where the law and people's finances and emotions, they all intersect. And that's why being transparent and really understanding the process is so important for everyone involved.
Speaking of transparency, we've talked a lot about the court's role in overseeing probate. But what about the executor or the administrator? What do they have to do about the estate's debts?
Oh, their role is crucial. They're the ones with the keys to the kingdom, like we said. They have to gather the assets, figure out the debts, and create a plan to settle them based on that priority list we talked about.
So they're like the estate's financial manager, making sure everything is handled properly, ethically.
Exactly. They're the point person. They talk to creditors, maybe negotiate settlements, and make sure that plan the court approves is followed to a T.
That sounds like a huge responsibility, especially if there are disagreements or things get complicated. Are there any safeguards to make sure they don't, take advantage of their position?
That's a really good point. And yeah, the Philippine legal system does have some ways to prevent that. Like we said before, the executor or administrator, they're accountable to the court, and they have to act in the best interest of the estate and the heirs. They have to give regular reports about what they're doing, and any beneficiary can go to the court if they think something's wrong.
So it's not just blind trust. There are checks and balances to keep things accountable.
Exactly. The court is there to keep an eye on things, review the reports, address concerns, step in if needed. It's about protecting the process and making sure it's fair for everyone.
Sounds like the whole system is designed to be as transparent and fair as possible, even when there are conflicts or things get tricky.
That's the goal. Although in real life, these estate settlements can be messy and emotions run high. Family dynamics come into play, people disagree, and sometimes even good intentions get lost in the mix.
You're right. It's not just about the legal stuff. It's about people's legacies, their final wishes, and often a lot of money. It's a recipe for both legal and emotional challenges.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand the legal side, the roles everyone plays, and the potential problems that can pop up.
Knowledge is power in these situations, for sure. And sometimes, even with the best intentions, it can feel really overwhelming to deal with all this.
You're telling me. That's where getting help from a lawyer who specializes in probate can be so valuable.
Like having a guide to lead you through the legal jungle, right? Anticipate the obstacles and help you make the right decisions at each step.
Exactly. They can explain the law clearly, fight for your rights, and make sure everything runs smoothly and fairly, reducing stress and conflict.
Sounds like having that expert by your side can make all the difference. Instead of feeling lost and confused, you can feel more confident and in control.
Exactly. And remember, even though we're focusing on the legal and procedural stuff, probate is ultimately about people. It's about honoring the deceased's wishes, navigating family relationships, and making sure their legacy is distributed fairly.
That's a great point. It's easy to get lost in the legal details, but at the end of the day, it's about handling a delicate and often emotional process with care and fairness.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been incredibly helpful. We've really gotten into the nitty-gritty of debt settlement and probate, explored the roles everyone plays, and emphasized how important transparency and accountability are throughout the process.
It's been great talking about this. And remember, knowledge is power, especially when you're dealing with the ins and outs of probate.
Absolutely. We've covered a lot, but there's still more to uncover.
Right. In part 3, we'll wrap up our deep dive, looking at what makes inheritance and asset distribution unique, and give you some valuable takeaways to help you navigate this whole landscape with more confidence.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into probate. We've covered a ton of ground, from figuring out where these proceedings happen to tackling that whole debt settlement maze. But now, let's talk inheritance. What happens to those assets once the debts are paid off and things are squared away?
That's where it all comes together, right? The distribution of what's left to the rightful heirs. This is where the deceased's wishes, if they had a will, finally get carried out.
Yeah, like the final chapter, the estate reaches its destination.
Exactly. It's about closing the legal and financial side of things, but also making sure the deceased's intentions are respected.
Okay, so let's say there is a valid will. Does the court just follow the instructions and that's it?
Well, it sounds simple, but even with a will, the court's still super important. Probate is all about making sure things are fair, no funny business. So the court checks the will, confirms it's legit, and makes sure the distribution follows the law and what the deceased really wanted.
So it's not just a formality, they're really involved in making sure everything's on the up and up.
Oh, absolutely. They're like the guardians of the whole process, making sure no one's taking advantage and that the distribution is legit, reflecting the deceased's true wishes.
I like that, like a referee making sure everyone's playing by the rules.
Exactly. Making sure the rules are followed and everyone's rights are protected.
So what happens when there's no will? How does the court figure out who gets what then?
That's where things get a little more complicated. When there's no will, it's called intestacy, and the law decides how the assets are divided. Specifically, the rules of succession in the Philippine Civil Code.
So there's like a backup plan. So the estate doesn't just get stuck in legal limbo?
Right. The law steps in and provides a framework for determining the heirs and how much each gets based on their relationship to the deceased.
Sounds like a big family tree puzzle.
Yeah.
So who gets priority in these situations?
The law gives priority to the closest relatives. Usually, it's the surviving spouse and children first, then parents, siblings, and so on. Each relative gets a specific share depending on how closely they're related.
So the closer you are to the deceased, the higher you are on the inheritance ladder, so to speak.
You could put it that way. It's about distributing the estate in a way that reflects those family ties,
Like a legal safety net, making sure that even without a will, things are handled fairly and the deceased's closest family is taken care of.
Exactly. It brings some order and predictability to a situation that could otherwise be chaotic and emotionally charged.
This has been such an eye-opening journey. We've explored probate from A to Z, from figuring out which court handles things to the final distribution of assets.
It has been fascinating, hasn't it? And remember, knowledge is power. Understanding these processes can really help you navigate probate with confidence and ensure that the deceased's legacy is handled properly and fairly.
For sure. And I think the biggest takeaway for anyone going through this is that getting legal counsel is crucial. Having a skilled lawyer to guide you through the complexities and protect your interests can make all the difference.
Couldn't agree more. It's like having a trusted expert by your side, making sure you make informed decisions and the process goes as smoothly as possible.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into probate proceedings in the Philippines. I hope this has been helpful and given you a better understanding of this complex but important process.
It's been a pleasure sharing these insights. And remember, even though probate often deals with the end of a life, it's also about honoring legacies, respecting wishes, and making sure things are passed on fairly to the next generation.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into a new and fascinating topic.